Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Regina Donlon. I am a history lecturer here in Carlow College, St. Patrick's, and the next lecture in the Leaving Cert lecture series for 2026 is going to be based on history and, in particular, the Irish diaspora. So, my own research specialism is 19th century Irish and European migration to the United States. So today we will look particularly at famine migration from Ireland to the United States between about 1850 and 1900. So today we're going to take a transnational approach to our study of migration. We'll examine some key terms, for example, step migration and chain migration. And then we'll look at the process of leaving itself before having a quick look at what life was like for the famine Irish in the United States. Okay, so first of all, then, before we begin thinking about migration and the experience of that, we should probably learn some of the key terminology. So, two terms are particularly important for how we understand the process of migration of not just Irish people, but European people generally in the 19th century. So, the first of these is chain migration, and essentially that. Means that one person will immigrate first. They will become integrated into the local community. They will find employment. They will establish social networks. They'll find somewhere to live. More often than not, they will find an Irish community into which they can integrate. And as this first immigrant becomes more integrated into the process of being an immigrant and living in an immigrant community, they will very, very slowly but steadily begin to find their feet, and they will engage in correspondence with their family back home. Now, importantly, the immigrant letter that they're going to send is also possibly going to contain money or perhaps even a ticket for the next person in the family to emigrate. So our initial immigrants then, they're sending home remittances, they're sending home advice, they're sharing experiences, and in some instances as well, our immigrants are sending back the American trunk, which might have, for example, blankets for the winter or overcoats for winter, or other bits and pieces that might enhance the life of the family back home. So once the second person then receives enough money from their relative in the United States to emigrate, they will embark on the process. And it's what we see establishing then is essentially a new family block emerging in the United States. So these two people will now perhaps work together. They'll continue to send money back to Ireland, and then that paves the way for the third person in the family to emigrate. It's a very, very valuable process for immigrants to use, because they will, generally speaking, all move into the same home together. So they are working on the one hand for their own betterment in the host society, but they're also continuing to maintain that link with Ireland and sending the letters home and sending money home to ensure the flow of people outward. So chain migration then essentially performs as a chain, and each of the individual migrants are links within that chain. So you have one person who begins the process, and then gradually the chain gets longer as more and more people migrate. Step migration, then, by contrast, happens at a much, much slower pace. Um, in chain migration, the journey is quite compressed, whereas in step migration, it takes place at much slower time intervals. So, for example, you might have somebody living in rural Ireland who initially migrates internally into the local big town. They might get work as a domestic servant or a shop assistant boy or something like that. Then they'll move on from there onto the next, or most local big city, where again they'll find employment, start saving some money, and before long they might be able to make the trip across to England, where again they'll settle for a couple of months, perhaps earn enough money to buy their passage to the United States, and then gradually make their way on a passenger liner over to the US. So what you see happening in this process is that the migration is not compressed in the same way that we see in chain migration, but it takes place at undefined time intervals, and essentially people are moving step by step through their migration journey. Interestingly, it does not cease once you get to the United States. If we look at some US federal census data for the mid-19th century, we can actually see many examples of Irish people who get married in the US or indeed are already married. But we can track their residency across the United States by looking at the places of birth of their children. And so we can plot these people on a map then based on where their children were born, which also helps us to figure out what the step migration process is upon the point of arrival. Okay, so there are three different types or perhaps categories of migration that we should think about as we move through our discussion of 19th century migration. And again, this kind of um, applies, particularly this first category applies into the 20th century as well. So first of all, we'll look at voluntary migration. These are essentially a group of people who voluntarily migrate insofar as they're not forced out of the country, they're not cleared off land, and their passage is not paid for. So, who are we talking about? People who perhaps cannot find employment, people who are traveling as part of a chain migration process, or indeed people who are simply looking for a sense of adventure. These are essentially volunteer immigrants, people who are leaving by choice, or indeed in some cases by necessity. The second group of immigrants that we need to be aware of are those who availed of assisted immigration. And essentially, what that means is that all or part of their passage was paid for by, for example, a government scheme or a landlord assisted immigration scheme. Um, so two examples could be the um, landlord assisted immigration scheme from the Fitzwilliam estate in County Wicklow, or indeed the Earl Grey female orphan immigration scheme to Australia between 1848 and 1850. So these were schemes where people were identified as potential immigrants and they had their passage paid for either by the government in the case of the female orphans or by the landlord in the case of the Fitzwilliam estate. The third type of immigrant category that we'll talk about is philanthropic funds. So, for example, schemes that were established by philanthropists. These were rare enough in the famine period, but towards the end of the 19th century, we see a lot more philanthropic schemes starting to emerge. Vera Foster is one of these philanthropists who was quite active during the 1850s, and he emigrated young women, particularly to the United States, at his own expense. And then as we move into the 1880s, we have people like James Hack Chooke, who establishes the Chooke immigration schemes from the west of Ireland in the 1880s. So there are various different means and methods by which people can migrate. For the most part, people fall into the voluntary migration scheme insofar as it is an independent migration. Their passage is not paid for by the state, by a philanthropic fund, or indeed by a landlord. Um, okay, so very briefly then, I just want to consider the assisted immigration schemes in a little bit more detail. So, as we've said, they could be paid for by governments, landlords, or indeed charitable institutions or philanthropists. The landlord context is particularly interesting because it has uh, a reasonably negative image attached to it. The landlord assisted immigration schemes were perceived by many as being quite problematic because they were considered to be forced immigration. People like John Mitchell, for example, a member of the Young Ireland movement in the 1840s, used these landlord assistant immigration schemes to highlight how Irish people were being forcibly removed from their land. This had a double payoff in some ways for the landlord because they were able to remove unprofitable tenants from their estates while on the other hand being able to consolidate the estate into larger holdings, which in turn would make it more profitable. Um, However, these landlord-assisted immigration schemes became increasingly politicized because of the way the Young Ireland movement in particular were establishing a narrative around Irish people being forcibly removed from their land. So when we think about these landlord assisted schemes in particular, they do have quite a problematic legacy attached to them. What we do know is that when we follow immigrants who travel as part of these schemes, they had a significantly better set of opportunities upon arrival in their place of destination, and some of the landlords who were more benevolent in nature actually had provided employment and accommodation for their tenants once they arrived in their place of destination. The government assisted schemes were quite narrow, I guess, in terms of how they were designed. One of the most famous of these was the Earl Grey Female Orphan Immigration Scheme. So they were funded by the Colonial Office. The government generally tended to be reluctant to fund the passage of people out of Ireland during the second half of the 19th century. And this was based on on a number of 19th century ideologies which suggested that poor people should not be given aid or charity for free. The prevailing belief was that people should work for some sort of reward rather than be rewarded for their perceived laziness. And so government assisted immigration schemes then were few and far between, but the ones that we are aware of and do have quite a lot of knowledge on are schemes that were established by the Colonial Office to try and populate the colonies in modern day Australia. So the schemes were organized, I guess, or administered at least by the local boards of guardians for the poor law unions, and they would identify young women, particularly, who would be suitable immigrants. Um, and they, in turn, then were removed from the workhouse in Ireland, put on ships, and sent to Australia to help repopulate the colonies and provide a gender balance between males and females in the colonies in New South Wales, in particular. Okay. So, if we had more time, I would love to tell you more about these landlord schemes and indeed the Earl Grey scheme. But given the fact that our voluntary migrants constitute the largest number of immigrants that we see during the second half of the 19th and indeed early 20th centuries, I think the focus on them is probably more beneficial. So if we were to put some numbers on this, then between 1841 and 1860, we're looking at approximately 1.7 million Irish-born people arriving in the United States. We have fairly decent figures on this, primarily because on disembarkation from your passenger ship, your details would be recorded, and so there are fairly cohesive statistics available to us in terms of the number of Irish-born people arriving in the United States in that period immediately post-famine. Um, so there is a historian called Thomas Archdeacon who has done significant work on the Irish in the United States during the second half of the 19th century. And he has noted that Irish immigrants tended to settle in the three port cities along the eastern seaboard, specifically Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. So these became the three main ports of entry for the Irish. In some instances, we see Irish people arriving in the south, in New Orleans, and also less common, but worth noting nonetheless, people arriving into San Francisco on the west coast. We see this particularly in the late 1840s into the 1850s because of the Californian gold rush, which happened in the late 1840s. But for the most part, we're looking at Irish people settling along the eastern seaboard in our three port cities. Archdeacon argues that it took immigrants approximately 7 years before they would feel integrated enough to migrate further west and begin chasing the American dream in earnest. So what we see happening then, particularly in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, is that very deeply developed and deeply entrenched immigrant communities start to emerge. Now, it's important to place Irish migration in the broader context here in the second half of the 19th century because it's not just famine immigrants or people in the generation after the famine that are migrating to the United States. Irish migration during this period between 1850 and 1900 represents part of what we call the old wave of immigration. So there is a significant European migration happening in the second half of the 19th century, and the Irish immigrant community form part of that. Okay, so it's not an immigration that's happening in isolation, it does have context. And there are significant numbers of other European populations arriving at the same time. Um, Our Irish immigrants are quite unique because of the fact that they are very well um, established immigrant group. So generally speaking, when we look at immigrant communities, we're going to examine them under five main themes or through five lenses. The first of these is economic, the second is religious, the third is political, the fourth is social and cultural, and the fifth is a gendered lens. Okay. So when we examine societies through these different lenses, what we see is that the Irish are uniquely consolidated in terms of their immigrant profile, in terms of their religious beliefs, in terms of their political orientation. And even though the Irish were not the most prominent immigrant group by number, they were outranked by German immigrants in this period in terms of physical number of people arriving. But even though they are not the most numerous population of immigrants, you would probably have to argue quite convincingly, I think, that they were the most successful group of immigrants that arrived in the United States in the second half of the 19th century. And the reason for that, perhaps, is because of the fact that their immigrant profile, broadly speaking, was similar across the board. So what we're looking at here, if we are building an immigrant profile at this point, we're looking at largely unskilled workers. So people coming from farm laboring backgrounds, seeking unskilled work in factories, for example, or indeed domestic servants, if you're female. We are looking at a group of people who are largely Catholic in religious belief. We are looking at people who vote for the Democratic Party in terms of political persuasion. And quite uniquely, even though the Irish immigrant community was not protecting the Irish language, there was a very distinct immigrant culture there. There was the celebration of St. Patrick's Day, for example. There were very deeply embedded traditions within the Irish immigrant community, which helped them to consolidate their Irish immigrant identity. Okay. Now, that needs to be balanced by the fact, obviously, that not everybody who traveled during this period was, unskilled in terms of their labor output, Catholic, democratic voting, and, engaged in celebrations around St. Patrick's Day. Rather, what we're looking at here is that the majority of people broadly fit this profile. It's important to say as well that we did have Protestant working class immigrants during this period. We did have skilled workers immigrating during this period. We did have Irish immigrants who were part of the professional classes. And indeed, we had Irish immigrants who voted Republican during this period. So when we use these community identifying labels, we're speaking in very, very broad terms. Okay, so before we start to break down the community under each of these thematic lenses that we've already identified, then I think another element that's important for us to be aware of is the image of the Irish upon migration. So this is a very well-known political cartoon, which was published actually in 1880 in a paper from, I think it was actually Harper's Weekly, published in the United States. And this is a very, very telling illustration because it gives us a sense of the attitude that was developing towards Irish immigrants by the late 19th century. So what we can see here then is a large passenger ship arriving from Ireland, containing a significant number of pauper immigrants. And the reason we can identify that obviously is because the caption says poorhouse from Galway, and you can see the ship is overcrowded. Poorhouse from Galway implies that these are another batch of unskilled labourers, pauper population, people who could potentially be a burden on the host community rather than a positive asset. Um, there's also a bigger political question here to be answered between about the relationship between the United States and Great Britain. But this is telling because it sort of gives us a sense, excuse me, of the emerging nativism that we see from about 1860 onwards. And the Irish community and the German American community in particular were, I guess, targeted by nativist ideologies uh, from about 1860 onwards. And this is just one of the many, many illustrations that has anti-Irish sentiment attached to it. Now, again, this is not something unique to the Irish experience in the United States. We see it happening across the Irish experience in Great Britain as well. Hmm, okay, so I thought one of the best ways then for us to examine these communities would be to actually identify a case study. So what we find about Irish immigrant communities is that they largely have some sort of distinguishing name attached to them. So we're going to move beyond our immigrant communities in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia for now, and we're going to go to the Midwest, specifically to St. Louis, Missouri, and have a look at that immigrant community. As you move around Irish America, you will see the Irish ghetto, essentially, or the Irish slum area having quite distinctive names. So in St. Louis, the Irish slum was known as the Kerry Patch. Um, in Cleveland, for example, it was known as the Ackle Patch. In St. Paul, Minnesota, it was known as the Connemara Patch. But it had different names. In Scranton, Pennsylvania, for example, it was known as the Irish Hill. Uh, but inevitably, the place where the majority of Irish people lived was quite easily identifiable. Now, given the profile of the Irish immigrant that we established a few minutes ago, the fact that they were largely poor, unskilled laborers, means that you would more often than not find the Irish neighborhood close to the central business district of the city because that was where availability of the most unskilled labor actually was. So we're looking at what we would consider inner city communities um, who are living in the lowest type and lowest rent areas, worst type of accommodation. And generally, they will be quite close to places like docks or railway or railroad stations. Okay, so what we see here then, if we look at the image, we'll see the Kerry Patch in 1850 was quite small, close to the central business district, just about 4 blocks from the Mississippi River, suggesting to us that the majority of Irish unskilled labour in the city was linked to dock work. So St. Louis is an important city in terms of westward migration, but also in terms of the movement of goods in a north-south direction through the United States as well. So St. Louis is a key place of immigrant settlement in terms of unskilled labor. So the Kerry Patch then emerges in 1850. It's originally settled by a group of immigrants who arrived from County Kerry, and then gradually over the course of the next 30 years, it quadrupled in size, so that by the time we get to 1880, it is a very, very significant immigrant community. Because of its location within the city and its proximity to the docks, the area very quickly developed into a slum. Now, what's quite unique about the Kerry Patch is that we see a lot of transnational behavior in how the patch operated. So, given the fact that the majority of the original settlers were from County Kerry, they actually brought with them an awful lot of their clan-like traditions that they had been used to living with back in West Kerry. So, for example, the original settlers of the Kerry Patch elected its own king, who was essentially the clan leader. And again, this is something that we see happening among communities on the Blasket Islands, for example, or indeed we also have evidence of it happening on the Inniskea Islands in Mayo. So this community then decided that they would elect their own leader, essentially their own king. And in the Kerry Patch in St. Louis, it was a member of the Sheehan family. Now, it did leave the Sheehans at one point, but this title and this honor returned to the family towards the end of the 19th century. So the whole purpose then of the King of the Kerry Patch was essentially to maintain law and order, because there was distrust of the city authorities and the city infrastructures that maintained social behavior. Okay, so we also then had a more dubious element to life in the Kerry Patch. We had the emergence of gangs that protected certain parts of the Kerry Patch, and some of these were gangs such as Egan's Rats, or indeed Hogan's Gang. So there were very particular parts of the Kerry Patch where you could and could not move around. So Dennis Sheehan then was the first king of the Kerry Patch. He was elected, not in traditional terms that we would understand today, but he was appointed, I guess, is a more appropriate term, in 1855. His son Jack, so after Dennis died, his son Jack was only 9 at the time, and so he was not deemed old enough to maintain law and order within the slum itself. And so, for a brief period, then the title of King of the Kerry Patch moved beyond the family. But upon Jack coming of age, at the age of 21, he was appointed as King of the Kerry Patch in 1873. Now, what we actually see happening as time progresses is that Jack Sheehan, um, who was king of the Kerry Patch from 1873 until 1935, essentially became a very well respected local politician. He was responsible for maintaining law and order within the Kerry Patch itself, settling disputes, particularly among the gangs. But also, he had this sort of diplomatic role where he negotiated with landlords. And Jack Sheehan also engaged in a more formalized political process. He sat on the board of public schools for St. Louis, for example, and he was a well-respected member of the local community. So what initially emerged as a tradition brought with the original immigrants from Ireland sort of developed, I guess, into a more structured role within the Irish immigrant community itself. Okay, so as I said, some of these gangs controlled different parts of the patch. And so and again, this kind of has links to the homeland. So what we would see here, Egan's Rats and Hogan's Gang, for example, these would be quite analogous with the Ribbon Man organizations that we would have seen in Ireland in the 1820s and 1830s. So again, it's more or less established along a townland structure, which they would have brought with them from Ireland. But in the American instance, it becomes territorialized through city blocks, for example. So Egan's Rats and Hogan's Gangs are essentially what we would call ribbon man organizations in Ireland in the 1820s and 30s. And as a result of that, then these gangs felt quite a lot of ownership over certain parts of the Kerry Patch. And so what we see emerging then is, even though we refer to the area as the Kerry Patch. Within it, there are sub-communities and sub-districts. So we have places like Wildcat Chute, Clabber Alley, Poverty Pocket, and indeed Castle Thunder. And depending what gang you were or were not part of, you you could have access to certain areas and you could not have access to other areas. So this was a very unique way of establishing community dynamics, and we cannot really underplay the importance of transnational behavior here, because what we're seeing is that immigrants are bringing their way of living, their traditions, their customs, their understanding of how societies work with them from Ireland and integrating them into their Irish American experience. So the image here is from primary source text, which you can actually access on archive.org if you're interested. But it is an illustration by a German American commentator called James Boole, published in a book called A Tour of St. Louis, produced in 1878. And this is his interpretation of a woman living in the Kerry Patch. And interestingly, he compares this image with a German American woman who is living in the German um, ethnic community, which was known as Soulard. And he compares the two of them and how economically deprived the Irish immigrant community was. However, it is important to say that not all people remained in the slum, and social mobility was a key objective of many of these immigrant communities. And so, what we see then is that immigrant ghettos like this are quite transient in nature. So you might arrive in the immigrant ghetto or ethnic community. You'll stay there for possibly 1 or 2 or maybe 3 years, but gradually, even though you're living in these appalling conditions, Irish people were very, very good at saving money. And in some instances, they didn't actually want to improve the shanties that they were living in because they carried trauma with them again from their Irish experience, because they were afraid if they did fix the door or fix the shutters, that their rent might actually be increased. So even though they look like they're very impoverished communities, Irish people were actually very, very good in terms of saving money, investing money, and indeed, this enabled them to achieve social mobility. We see this very, very clearly in St. Louis because by the early 20th century, the Irish ghetto community or the Irish ghetto region, if you like, in St. Paul had essentially um, declined enough that it was no longer considered to be the Irish slum. It was actually replaced by a group of Vietnamese immigrants who settled in what was the former Kerry Patch. And so if we trace this community over time, then from 1850 into the 1920s and 1930s, we actually see that Irish people no longer are staying within the boundaries of the Kerry Patch, but what they're actually doing is moving out to the St. Louis suburbs. And this is a very, very key marker of economic success on the one hand, but also social mobility. And if we look at the types of Irish immigrants who were living in Dogtown, which was the new Irish ethnic neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, what we actually see is that we have an increasing number of what could be considered respectable occupations, people engaging in police work, for example, or becoming city firemen, or indeed increasingly we see people having more sort of professional qualifications. So all of this is linked then with increasing economic stability, social mobility out of the immigrant ghetto, and eventual emergence into an ethnic community type of model that we see in Dogtown in St. Louis. Okay, so for the last part of the lecture, then, what I'd like to do is to consider each of these communities in a more general thematic way. So if we think about Irish immigrants, either in the United States or Great Britain during this time, we would associate them with being largely unskilled workers. So they're finding work as laborers, perhaps on building sites, or indeed as domestic servants or indeed factory work. We find an awful lot of Irish women in particular in St. Louis, for example, working in tobacco factories and as well as being engaged in domestic service. Social networks were quite important in terms of securing employment. And again, if we trace Irish immigrants through sources like the city directories, and look at family blocks within that, we can very, very clearly see how families linked their employment opportunities through that family network itself. You'd often find two or three siblings, for example, working within the one delivery company. Um, Brothers might be working as delivery men, whereas you might find sisters or other siblings working in more administrative positions. So, and again, this kind of is reflected over time. Initially, people are finding work on building sites, and then gradually, as city infrastructures start to develop, we find people working on, city water schemes, for example, which is in fact a semi-skilled type of employment in the 19th century. So employability began at the very lowest level, but progression again was quite possible for both genders, it has to be said. And Irish women in particular very much valued the economic mobility that the American Midwest brought them. Interestingly, as well, the Irish became very much involved in trade union movements. We see this if we look at the Irish who worked in the silver mines in Butte, Montana, for example, or indeed the clay mines in Scranton, Pennsylvania. So again, this wasn't sort of an isolated experience. We do find Irish people very much involved in trade union movements representing unskilled labor right across the country. And interestingly, again, this is sort of linked to their experience of the homeland because in situations where people are not being fairly treated, we have evidence of this ribbon man behavior and these kind of threatening letters starting to emerge. So again, that link with the homeland is always very much maintained in an Irish context. One of the things that the Irish immigrant community, particularly in the United States, I would say between about 1850 and 1950, one of the most important things Irish immigrant communities protected was their Catholicism. Now, again, this is not particularly surprising because if you look at the timeline here, Catholic emancipation in Ireland was only granted in 1829. And therefore, by the time we get to 1850, and our famine immigrants, this is the first generation of Irish people who actually have the right to practice their religion. And so their experience then of being immigrants in America is very, very closely linked with their Catholicism. And Catholicism becomes an ingrained part of their ethnic identity. So with that in mind, then Irish American Catholics began to dominate the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. It was very, very well structured. So by the time we get to 1900, we have Irish archbishops in many of the main archdioceses across the United States. We had Archbishop Hughes in New York, Archbishop Williams in Boston, Feehan in Chicago. We had Archbishop Reardon in San Francisco and Archbishop Richard Kenrick Lewis, Richard Kenrick in St. Louis. Now, interestingly, the majority of these people are graduates of the Irish seminary system, Maynooth graduates, for example, who are being emigrated with the purpose of preserving Catholicism among the Irish. It's very much a grassroots movement insofar as the Catholic Church became a very prominent unifying feature among the Irish and was a key factor in terms of how the Irish consolidated their identity. So at very, very local level, you would have what were known as ethnic parishes. So inevitably, if you look across the United States, it doesn't matter if you look at somewhere small like Toledo, Ohio, um, or Fort Wayne, Indiana, or Little Rock, Arkansas, if there's an Irish community there, you'll probably find a St. Patrick's Catholic Church. But in the bigger cities, for example, St. Louis, we had other ethnically identifying labels that told us that they were Catholic churches. So, for example, we had St. Lawrence O'Toole's parish in the Kerry Patch in the southern part, and in the northern part of the Kerry Patch, we had the parish St. Bridget of Erin. So these are very, very clearly Irish ethnic uh, Catholic parishes. So, it's almost impossible to understate how important it is for Irish communities in terms of their relationship with the Catholic Church in consolidating their own ethnic identity. So you would have more often than not an Irish-born priest, very, very possibly a priest who was fluent in the Irish language and could hear confessions in the Irish language, which was especially important. But also the local Catholic priest took on a very pastoral role in terms of protecting the community, advising the community, establishing social infrastructures to try and mitigate the negative stereotypes that were permeating about Irish immigrants. And quite importantly as well, the local Catholic priest within these ethnic parishes was very, very influential in how it encouraged or in how they encouraged the local Irish community to vote. And so the link between the Catholic Church and the Democratic Party in the United States is extremely important throughout the second half of the 19th century, and indeed right up to the mid 20th century as well. Um, Okay, so if we move it on to politics, then we've already established the link between the Catholic Church and the Democratic Party. Um, and by and large, the majority of Irish Americans were Democratic voters. This is because the Democratic Party from about 1860 onwards had a particularly lenient view and indeed a positive view towards immigrants and immigrant communities. But as well as that, it was easier, I think, for Irish Americans to align in a more broader sense with the political aspirations of the Democratic Party. Now, the key thing here is that the Irish had learned, and again, this is a transnational impact of migration, but the Irish had learned through their quest for Catholic emancipation that if they unified and mobilized as one cohesive group of people, that they had more chance of actually getting their political aspirations achieved. And the timeline here is not coincidental. The Catholic Association in Ireland emerged in the 1820s. And essentially, what Daniel O'Connell taught the Irish people was that if we all come together, we can achieve our political goals. And so the famine immigrants that we see in the 1850s then are direct products of this system. So they understand the value of unifying behind a common cause. And the Democratic Party, it has to be said, were very, very receptive naturally to that type of strategy. So the Irish had learned the importance of mass political mobilization then in Ireland. And by the time they got to the United States, again, shepherded, guided, and perhaps directed in some cases by the local Catholic priest, they understood that if they all moved in unison, political control initially and dominance eventually could be maintained. Uh, so the Irish then adopted the model of the political machine, and that essentially meant that as long as you adhered to um, the rules of the machine, it could be mutually beneficial, not just for the Democratic Party, but for individual immigrants themselves. Tammany Hall in New York is perhaps the best example of this, but we see examples of it across the United States. And essentially, this was political representation for personal gain of some sort. In St. Louis, for example, this practice was known as boddle, Boddle, whereby in exchange for your vote, some sort of benefit would be received by the local community. And so this is how, or one example of how the political machine worked in 19th century Irish America. Okay, and so finally then we'll move on. We're getting towards the end now. I just wanted to link back with that idea of anti-Irish sentiment. And here's one of the good examples of that because what we see here is that link between Irish American politics and Irish American Catholicism. And so this image here is a play on the golden goose and how the Irish community in particular were very, very effective at reaping all of the benefits and rewards for working together, uh, in order to achieve their political goals. So what we see here then is a Catholic priest. There's very obvious imagery there in terms of the priest wearing the traditional a garb of a priest in the 19th century. We also have a holy water font to the center of the image. And then to the left of the image, as I look at it, I can see this almost ape-like creature who is supposed to represent your ordinary average Irish immigrant. Now, there's an important caveat here, I guess, or an important explanation, because it had long been perceived in racial theory that the Celtic race of people were inferior to the Anglo-Saxon race of people. And so a visual representation of that then is clearly the Irish immigrant being depicted as more simian-like or more ape-like to reflect his lack of biological development. And so the representation then of the Irish here is very, very intentional in how it's depicted. And what we can see is the golden goose is essentially the Democratic Party. That's the message the um, cartoon wants us to understand. It has been carved wide open by Irish paupers and the Irish American Catholic Church. And from the golden goose, the Irish have taken all of the golden eggs. And so you can see in the background then that there are eggs labeled public money and all other sorts of political advantages. It's interesting as well that the map in the back of that image is done at ward level, demonstrating how prominent and how embedded Irish American local politics was in the process. The next one is an image from from 1863. It was published around the time of the New York draft riots in 1863 because Irish people did not want to be drafted into the Union Army. Now, it has to be said this was not because Irish immigrants were pro-slavery by any means. There was a much more concrete fear in the Irish community. Because the majority of Irish immigrants were unskilled labourers, they feared what the abolition of slavery would result in because they also understood that freed slaves would also be part of that unskilled labour market. And so the Irish then were very much afraid that their own economic opportunities and employment opportunities would be under threat if abolition was achieved. So it wasn't necessarily an ideological decision um, that they opposed um, emancipation, but it was more driven by economic concerns. So what we see here then is the scales. On one side we have south, and on the other side we have north. Um, our Irish immigrant then is on the right-hand side of the scales as I'm looking at it. He's sitting on the seat called termed white. And again, he is depicted as being racially inferior. He is an ape-like creature, suggesting that he is under-evolved. Again, anti-Irish sentiment and nativism sort of playing itself out there. But interestingly, on the other side of the scales, we have a slave sitting on a seat, which is termed black, also depicted as an ape-like creature, again suggesting racial inferiority. And these two guys then they are balanced across the scale, suggesting that they are considered, of equal weight uh, in terms of how they are perceived by American society. So yeah, this is just another really good example, I think, of the anti-Irish sentiment that we see in the second half of the 19th century within the American press. Okay, so finally then I just wanted to take a quick look at Irish society. So we have copious amounts of Irish organizations. Probably the most important of these, or at least one of the longest existing of these organizations, is the Ancient Order of Hibernians. It was a fraternal organization established in 1836 in New York. It was exclusively Catholic and exclusively Irish, and anybody who was part of the AOH, or indeed the Ladies Auxiliary to the AOH, was subscribing to a very, very specific type of Irish identity. its main purpose originally was to guard against nativism and to protect Catholic churches from attack by nativists. Um, but gradually it developed into a social organization, a very important social organization, because this was where economic networks were established, social networks were maintained, political deals were negotiated and orchestrated. So even though these cultural and social organizations, on the surface at least, had a more kind of relaxed agenda, they were incredibly important in terms of consolidating Irish immigrant identity and ensuring that the ethnic identity remained solid. And finally, then, I just wanted to take a look again at an illustration from Harper's Weekly, which was published in the 1870s, and it's a depiction of St. Patrick's Day. Um, So it just so happened that St. Patrick's Day that year coincided with a local election. This is an illustration from state elections in Massachusetts. And so what we see here then is again an Irish immigrant depicted again as being racially inferior with ape-like features. He has a sort of tattered hat on his head with a cross representing his Catholicism on it. He's wearing a sash with two shamrocks representing his ethnic identity. There's a shamrock hanging out of his mouth. And again, we can actually see the harp and that eagle symbol as well, suggesting that he's trying to integrate himself into Irish America, but he's still Irish by ethnicity. And what you can see if we look at the St. Patrick's Day badge that he's wearing on the lapel of his jacket, we can see a thumb, suggesting that the Irish are putting people under the thumb, that the Irish are controlling the Democratic nominee, sorry, the Democratic Party in Massachusetts. Okay, so again, that's, I guess, just to kind of reflect the nativism that many Irish people would have experienced. And again, this is not something that's unique, particularly to the United States. The Irish in Great Britain had a fairly similar experience, broadly speaking, during the period between about 1850 and 1920. Okay, so I guess that's where our discussion of the Irish in the second half of the 19th century in the United States will end. Thank you for taking the time to have a look at the lecture, and I hope you found it engaging. Take care.